Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome our audience to this joint program between the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Bremen Museum in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Rabbi Joe Prass, and I am the director of the Weinberg Center for Holocaust Education at the Bremen Museum. For over 25 years, the Bremen has welcomed hundreds of thousands of visitors to our museum, and we've been dedicated to educating the public on lessons that can be learned from this dark period of history. And it's especially poignant that we are having this program on November 10th, for it was on November 9th and 10th of 1938 that the world witnessed Kristallnacht. That night of broken glass when Jewish businesses had their windows broken, their synagogues burned, when 30,000 Jewish men were sent to Dachau, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, and other concentration camps. And the official figure for deaths as released by the Jewish officials in the aftermath of Kristallnacht was 91 souls lost their lives that evening, though we know that the number was much greater when you count those who died of their injuries in the days that followed. In the aftermath of that night, we know that the German government imposed a fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks, some $400 million at that time. And so we learn from history. And tonight and every night, it is so vitally important that we never forget our history and that we ensure that we learn to be better as a worldwide community. Our program this evening will take us on a fascinating journey to remind ourselves of how important the truth is, to never distort true history, no matter how uncomfortable or how painful it is. It's an honor to have Ms. Sylvia Foti with us this evening. And our moderator for the conversation this evening will be Grant Goshen. Mr. Goshen has a distinguished resume, but for tonight, he's asked to be introduced simply as an activist for Holocaust truth. A note about the flow of our program this evening. If you have questions, please, at the bottom of the screen, use the Q&A box, and you can type them in and we'll compile them. And as time will allow at the end of the program, we'll ask all of the questions that we can. On behalf of the Bremen Museum, I want to thank Alison Pure-Slovan, who will speak at the end on behalf of the Wiesenthal Center for her part in putting this program together, to Mr. Goshen and Ms. Foti for their part. And now let me turn the floor over to Grant, who will introduce our speaker. Grant.
How do I start my video? Rabbi, Can you start my video, please?
You should be able to do it yourself, sir. Let's see.
No, it says, Alison, it shows you as host.
Allison, can you let him in?
Start the video because the host has stopped it. Okay. So
just a second. We're going to get there. Allison, you're the host on this one, so you're going to have to do that or assign one of us to be the co-host as well. There we go. I'm going to leave the floor to you, sir.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Allison. Sylvia Foti is my personal hero. She is one of the bravest, most decent people I have ever met in my entire life. Sylvia, can you unmute yourself and begin your video, please?
Hi, Grant.
Sylvia.
Good to see you.
Sylvia, let's begin by giving us a 5-minute global overview of the story and your involvement.
Okay. Well, my book is The Nazi's Granddaughter, How I Discovered My Grandfather Was a War Criminal. And my grandfather, Jonas Noreika, was known as a big World War II hero in Lithuania. I grew up in Chicago, always hearing stories from my mother and grandmother about what a wonderful hero Jonas Noreika was. He fought very bravely against the communists twice during the 2 occupations of Lithuania. The first time they won, the second time they lost. And he died in a KGB prison, so he died a martyr for Lithuania's freedom. I heard that he was in a Nazi concentration camp. So my mom was working on this book and she was going to write the story. But then in the year 2000, she got very sick unexpectedly and was in the hospital and called me to her side. And she was only 60 years old, so nobody was expecting her death. But she seemed to know what was happening. And anyway, she called me to her bedside and she said, Sylvia, you have to write the book. And I knew exactly what book she was talking about because that's all she ever talked about. And at the time, I was a journalist. And so I said yes, because what else could you say to your mother in that position? And that was the last day of her consciousness. And then she died. She went into a coma, and then she died 2 weeks later. And then, I started kind of working on the story slowly and gathering all the materials from my mother and bringing it over here. She had a vast, vast archive of my grandfather. And then 5 months later, my grandmother, her mother, was on her deathbed, had a heart attack. And then she calls me to her side and says, Sylvia, how's the book? And I said, don't worry, Muchacha, it's fine. I'm going to get it done. I'm only 38 years old. I'm not going to let it go the way Mom did. I'm a journalist. And I thought I was giving her words of comfort. And then she says, don't write the book. Just let history lie. There's no need to dig around. And the significance of that went all over my head at that time because I still had no idea of why she would say that. I thought she was trying to give me a pass from, this rather insane, burdensome project that my mom left me. And I said, no, I'm going to do it. And, I promised Mom, I promised her I'm going to do it. And so that was the end of that conversation. And then she died about 2 weeks after that. And then they both wanted to be buried in Lithuania. And so my brother and I took their cremains to Lithuania in October. So this is all still the year 2000. All this is still happening in the year 2000. And so we bury them. And then after that, we go to the school named after Jonas Noreika. And it's in Shukone, a tiny town in northern Lithuania. And the children are there with flowers and singing beautiful folk songs, and we were greeted very, very grandly, like grandchildren of a hero. And then the director leads us into his office, and the teachers are all standing there, and he's showing us scrapbooks of my grandfather. And he says, so I heard you're going to write this book about Jonas Noreika, that you took the project over from your mother. And I said, yes, I did. And he said, our country really needs its heroes, and you're such a good daughter for doing this. And I said, thank you. And I said, as long as I'm here, why don't you let me know how you named the school after my grandfather? Because I never heard of it. And I thought this would be good for the book. And he said that they had this horrible Russian name before, because Lithuania was occupied by the Soviet Union after World War II until 1990. And they wanted to get rid of that name and give it a good patriotic Lithuanian name. And he says, your grandfather was born in this town. And so, of course, he's this magnificent hero. And it makes a lot of sense. So I thought, okay, I thought that was the end of the story. But then he pulls me to the side and he says, but I got a lot of grief over naming the school after your grandfather. And I said, grief from who? And he says, the Jews. And I said, what could the Jews possibly say about my wonderful, magnificent, legendary grandfather? And then he says it with the look as if everybody knows this and I'm the only one who doesn't. And he says, well, he was accused of killing Jews. And that was the very first time I ever heard that. It was a massive devastation to me. It was like a big blow, a gut punch. I was really unprepared for this. And so I had to sit down, and then he kind of, notices I'm upset. And he says, but don't worry, it's not true. It's just communist propaganda. So let's get on with, the rest of the day. And of course, I did the best I could after that. And I come home to Chicago. And then in Chicago, I talked to my father and some other people. And I'm like, have you ever heard this crazy rumor about Jonas Noreika killing Jews? And they're like, yeah, we heard it. And I'm like, what? Nobody ever said anything to me about this. And they're like, well, it's just communist propaganda. And it's not true. Why would anybody talk about this with you? So being Lithuanian in Chicago, I did the same thing all Lithuanians do, and I went into denial over it. And so it took me about 10 years to finally really approach the story. And so that's kind of that sets the stage for the beginning of how the book got started.
Sylvia, when the Lithuanian government talks about history, they normally talk from the beginning of Lithuanian time, and suddenly history ceases in 1941. Then history suddenly begins again in 1944 and carries on to the glorious independence today. There's just that period of time where there seems to be no knowledge about what happened within Lithuania. Now, the government of Lithuania still today considers your grandfather one of the most glorious heroes of the entire Lithuanian history. They have streets named for him, they have a school named for him, they have monuments all over the country for him. The government has declared that he was a rescuer of Jews. Could you please tell us, was he a rescuer of Jews or wasn't he a rescuer of Jews? And what happened in that period of time that Lithuania seemingly has forgotten?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a tiny bit to what you just said on my own end, was that these 3 bookcases behind me was all the material I collected for my mother and my grandfather. And I noticed that it's all on the 2 Soviet occupations, the first Soviet occupation and the second Soviet occupation. And there's nothing that was practically nothing there on the Nazi occupation. So that was very strange, just on my end here in my own archive. But I grew up hearing stories about how he helped save Jews too. I heard about how in Cholet, when he was chairman of the Cholet district during the Nazi occupation, that my mother gave little biscuits to Jews as they were passing by. I heard this story a lot of times. I heard how he tried to save some Jews also in Cholet. And most recently now, it came out that, through the Genocide Center even, that he saved Jews. So here's my take on it. My take on it is that while he was chairman of Cholet, I think we have to tell him that big thing, that, I discovered, we discovered many documents of what he signed. During that time, he signed about 1,000 documents, and of those 1,000 documents, 70 actually had to do with the Holocaust. And of those 70, one is like the worst one. And this is the document that completely changed my idea about Jonas Noreika. And this was about 10 years into the project. So after I saw this document, I completely said, okay, now I really need to know what happened during this Nazi occupation and what my grandfather did. And that document he signed on August 22nd, 1941, where he called for rounding up all the Jews and half-Jews in his region, the Cholet region, which was the second largest region of Lithuania at the time, and brought to a ghetto that he wanted a newly created ghetto in Žagarė, and this all had to be done in 1 week, August 22nd, and they all had to be there August 29th. So I forget the exact number, but it's about 2,000 Jews were rounded up, all ages, everyone, babies, grandmothers, everyone, and brought over to Žagarė. And then within 6 weeks, they were all slaughtered. So,
Sylvia, just in summary, how many Jews do you think your grandfather murdered?
well, based on the research, I think conservatively it's 8,000 and not conservatively 15,000.
Okay. Now, Sylvia, you and I only met 3 years ago.
I know.
Right. Our families have actually been connected for at least 100 years. Would you like to explain to the audience how our families have been connected?
Well, after I met you, we figured out that about 100 of your relatives were murdered in the Holocaust in the region where my grandfather was the chairman during the Nazi occupation. So it was kind of, a big revelation to both of us that my grandfather, was part of killing 100 of your relatives.
So for the audience, my family comes from the same region of Lithuania that Sylvia's family does. Our families must have taken water out of the same wells. They must have shopped in the same markets. And in 1941, Sylvia's grandfather murdered my relatives. Now, there have been very few descendants of Holocaust perpetrators that have stepped forward to tell the truth. Certainly, there is no case in the world that I know of where there's been an identification of the descendant of the murderer and the descendant of the victims that have come together to establish truth. When you established truth, can you tell the audience what your experience was from the Lithuanian government?
Yeah, when I started coming out with this story publicly, very openly talking about my revelation and my belief that my grandfather was a perpetrator during the Holocaust in Lithuania, I got a lot of pushback from the Lithuanian community, a lot of hate mail, some death threats, lost some friends, family members, upset with me, family members now who shun me in Lithuania. So I lost a lot of support, and there's just been a lot of pushback. They don't want to accept this, and they say you're just the granddaughter. What do you know?
So for the audience, I have filed approximately 20 legal actions against the government of Lithuania to try and force them to be truthful. Sylvia stepped forward and supported one of those lawsuits. When you did that, Sylvia, how did the government and the courts of Lithuania respond to you?
Well, they said that I disagree with my mother, and they said that I'm not an academician, I'm not a historian, I don't know how to look at the material critically the way an academic or a historian would look at it, and then I really have no understanding of what happened because I wasn't born yet then.
But the head of the government agency that is tasked with committing Holocaust fraud is not a historian, and their chief historian also wasn't a historian, he was a geologist. The other historians are also not historians, they're public relations experts. So when they rejected you, and they called you unreliable because you disagreed with your mother, did they review any of your 20 years of research?
I have to think that they didn't.
Have
Or
they, have they
if
yet?
they did, they dismissed it.
They dismissed it. Now, Sylvia, you've just returned from a trip to Lithuania. Your case, your expose, your book that is unbelievably readable, has made world headlines, has received an unbelievable amount of press. Can you tell me if the government of Lithuania has read your book yet?
I don't know. I didn't get the sense that they did yet.
Did anybody say to you that they had?
Nobody from the government, no.
Has,
No, I mean, I did meet with some historians from the Genocide Center, and the sense that we had, and the fact that we had a meeting was a big breakthrough, that we sat at the table. We sat at the same table and we had a discussion and we talked for about an hour. That part was wonderful. The part that was not so wonderful was to kind of figure out that I don't think the historians there had read the book yet.
now, Sylvia, you and you've been battling this for 20 years. I've been battling this for 10 years, and we combined forces 3 years ago. In that time, you and I have been repudiated, threatened, intimidated, vilified, harassed. What is your reception by the government of Lithuania today, and why do you think it is what it is?
Well, they don't know what to make of me yet. And it was, like I said, we were invited to sit at the same table with them. So that in itself is a breakthrough. They want to write a foreword to my book.
But
So
if they haven't read your book yet, and they haven't examined your evidence, on what grounds would they write a foreword?
well, I would hope they would read the book before they write the foreword, Grant. That's all I can hope.
That's all we can hope. Sylvia, after this 20 years that you've been fighting, I mean, I've never seen anybody work as hard with as much dedication to bring truth to light. This week, you have had an incredible breakthrough. Can you describe what that was?
Which breakthrough are you talking about, Grant?
Ira?
Which one?
Ira. For the audience.
Oh, Ira, you can tell them that one.
Okay. There is a grouping of 42 international governments that report on the Holocaust. In the face of overwhelming denial, intimidation, and fraud from the Lithuanian government, these 42 governments issued a combined statement affirming the correctness of Sylvia's research and identifying Lithuania as a Holocaust distortion state. Now, do you think that the government of Lithuania will respond to that in any way?
I don't know. My guess is they want to get on top of this. I don't know. And my guess is they're going to try. You know, when I was in Lithuania, I was received very warmly. You know how afraid I was of going there.
I was terrified for you. I
I know.
contacted multiple people in Lithuania trying to employ security services to protect your life. I mean, Sylvia, both you and I have had so many death threats over the years that I was very fearful of your security.
I was too. But you know, I went there through the Olga Lengel Institute. They had invited me to go, and they're a group that teaches teachers how to teach about the Holocaust. And this was the second year they were teaching teachers in Lithuania. And I presented a 90-minute seminar in my book and my findings to these teachers. And I was received very, very warmly. Like, they really heard my story. And some of them are going to have me Zoom now to their classes to talk to their students about this, their high school teachers. And then at the end of the seminar, one of the teachers had said, Sylvia, I really admire you for what you did and the story you wrote about your grandfather, but I still have a very difficult time believing that Jonas Noreka, this great hero, really did something that bad, but I'm trying. So that was a big breakthrough moment, I thought.
You know, Sylvia, we have to separate out the people of Lithuania from the government of Lithuania. For the most part, the average Lithuanian is a really fine, decent human being, that those that know what's going on from the government are absolutely horrified. This is a government program. This is not something that the people of Lithuania support. So there's under no circumstances can we stereotype or portray this as a national Lithuanian problem. It is a governmental Lithuanian problem. Now, Sylvia, there are strong ties between Lithuania and Israel, but the ties between Jews and Lithuania are fragile. Can you talk about, I mean, let's take this conversational personal for a few minutes, because we only met 3 years ago. And when you called me, I was more than very suspicious of you. In fact, I was immediately hostile to you. Can you talk about the relationship that you and I have created since, and what it bodes for relationships between Jews and Lithuanians?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredible that you and I, we're working on Jonas Noreka separately, and that our paths finally crossed in 2018 through your researcher. Andrius Kulikauskas got us together. And so, I was afraid to call you. I was afraid to contact you. I didn't know what you would say to me. And I finally convinced myself, because I finally told myself, well, who else did I write this book for if it isn't someone like Grant? So, I put on my big girl pants and made that phone call to you. And then, slowly, I think we got past our suspicions of each other and began to trust each other. And then I think we were both blown away at how much material both of us had. And then when I got your material, I had to rewrite my whole book again to add in all that material. And that just made the book so much more richer. And then you took stuff from what I found for your lawsuit too, and that made your lawsuit stronger. And since then we've become really, really good friends.
You're one of my dearest, closest, best friends in the whole world, Sylvia.
Back at you, Grant. Yeah, so I mean, we're in touch, constantly, sometimes several times a day. So, so we've become very good friends.
What does it mean for Lithuanians and Jews as people? This friendship and trust that you and I have developed.
I think it's missing. It's been missing. And I think if it could be reignited again, it would be healing. And I say this just from the Lithuanians' point of view. It would be very healing. I mean, there's a lot of work Lithuanians have to do. I went through a lot of work myself to come to terms with the truth. And that's no easy task. I mean, it took me 10 years, so I don't know how long it could take another 10 years for, if they really work at it. But once it's done, it's once, you get past all that trauma of, and the freaking out of what your nation was about, because you can kind of say, well, that was 80 years ago. You can't change the past. But you have to sort of accept it and move on from there, and hopefully never do that again. And then it becomes a very healing thing. But that can only be done on the truth.
based on the truth. Sylvia, there is no such thing as heritage guilt, but the people in the Lithuanian government that participate and perpetrate this denial, distortion, and revision, that share the values of people such as your grandfather, that elevate into hero status people that were Holocaust perpetrators, do remain guilty. The Lithuanian that has not participated in that has no guilt. Now, for the audience, the members of the Lithuanian government have stated that I wrote your book.
Yeah. That like really upsets me when they do that, because I have 2 writing degrees and I'm a writer and I struggled a lot to write this book. So, and you have what, a degree in international finance? I mean, you're a good writer, but you're not a writer. No,
I'm not. No, I'm not. But they say that I wrote your book. So the day that you and I first met, so to speak, I was sitting at my desk in my office, and this email popped up on my desk, and it said, "Hello, Mr. Goshen. My name is Sylvia Foti. I assume you know who I am. If you're willing to talk to me, I'd like to talk to you." I had a physiological reaction to that. I started shaking, sweating. I started having palpitations. I knew exactly who Sylvia is. And what I knew about her then is that she is the granddaughter of the Lithuanian that murdered my family. In our first conversation, Sylvia, that we had on the phone, you told me that you had written a manuscript, and then you emailed me the manuscript of this. And I sat down that night in the room I'm sitting in now, and I read the manuscript cover to cover, and I was in tears. It was the first time in my entire life that I had heard full truth from a Lithuanian. Why do you think that the government of Lithuania is so entrenched in their Holocaust fraud?
I think it's a psychological thing. It's very difficult. It's denial. It's denial at the governmental level. It's just very difficult to accept the idea that you did something wrong, or that your father did something wrong, or that your grandfather did something wrong. And so it's a lot easier just to pretend that that's not true, and to come up with all kinds of convoluted excuses to sort of rationalize how these Jews disappeared. And so I think that in general, with the Lithuanians who are so angry and so vehement, I think that deep down they honestly do not know, and that they're just in a state of denial.
Sylvia, the murders in Lithuania were public. People came to watch the murders as it was a spectator sport. 96.4% of the Jews of Lithuania were murdered in a very public way. Houses were empty. Jewish property was flowing through the economy. There was no way, there was absolutely no possible way that anybody couldn't have seen or heard about it. They would have had to. Yes.
But that was 1941.
Yes.
And then in come the Soviet Union and occupy Lithuania. And for the next 50 years, nobody gets to talk about anything at all unless you had permission to talk about it from the Russians. And the Jews that were killed, they were now all Soviet citizens. They weren't even referred to as Jews. Holocaust, nobody used the word Holocaust. So people, the ones who actually witnessed it, kept their mouths shut because they couldn't talk about it. And then they died. They didn't even talk about it. They died. And so that's how it disappeared. And the problem, and I grew up in Chicago. I didn't hear about Holocaust in Lithuania. That's how nobody knew.
Sylvia, I've been to Lithuania approximately a dozen times. I've worked on about 50 Jewish cemeteries in Lithuania. I've been working on historical projects in Lithuania. Almost every single Lithuanian I have met have told me that their family saved about a dozen Jews. Now, if you added everybody's dozen together, you'd probably have 5 million Jews rescued when there were 220,000 murdered. There are 915 or 917 righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem, which was 0.04% of the population were rescuers. 99.96% of the population are not registered as rescuers. Now, not all of them were perpetrators. Some of them, I'm sure, also tried to rescue but weren't successful. Some of them were bystanders, and some of them were perpetrators. Now, your grandfather is only one Holocaust perpetrator that the government of Lithuania has rewritten as a rescuer of a Jew or denied their participation in perpetrating the Holocaust. How many more years of exposés of being publicly identified by entities such as the US Congress and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the Simon Wiesenthal Center? I mean, there have been so many entities, governments, institutions that have confronted Lithuania and said to them, you are lying. And yet Lithuania has not moved 1 single millimeter. I'm asking you a question as an ethnic Lithuanian that is familiar with the Lithuanian population. How will they eventually assimilate the facts of what happened in Lithuania?
Well, I'm hoping my book will help, because my book took, when I was doing my research, I noticed that there's a Lithuanian version of what happened during the Holocaust, which is that it was all done by the Nazis. And there was a Jewish version of the Holocaust that said it was mostly done by the Lithuanians. And those are two very different perspectives of what happened. And so I tried to marry the two perspectives together and integrate it together into one book that makes it one narrative. And I hope that, because, and it helps that I'm not a historian, because my book is very emotional. So as his granddaughter, I get to express my emotions about how I feel about having a grandfather who was involved in the Holocaust, and it doesn't feel good. And I express all that. And because I'm his granddaughter, only his granddaughter, I can do that. Where a historian or an academician, they're told not to put their emotions into it. So I think it's important to discuss this, in an integrated fashion, and to kind of examine your own emotions about this too. And I really tried to write the story as a way that would touch a person's heart.
Sylvia,
I use a type of style, and it's called creative nonfiction, and that is a type of style that is purposefully trying to get into somebody's heart and not just their mind.
I don't think there's ever been a book like this, ever. I think yours is the very first. It's completely unique. Now, there have been 4 female Lithuanian writers that have stepped forward to tell the world that there's been fraud about their grandparents and history about their grandparents and their families have been rewritten. So this is not unfamiliar to Lithuanian society. There are currently 2 documentaries in process being made of your story, and possibly a full-length feature film. Do you think that the Lithuanian government will allow those to be shown inside Lithuania?
Well, you remember with you, I used to joke that my book will get published in every language but Lithuanian. So to my shock, a Lithuanian publisher, Kitos Knygos, picked it up. So that surprised me in the happiest of ways. And they're behind this book in Lithuania and really doing just a phenomenal job in the translation. They're finding things that, because they have more at their disposal. They're actually looking at the KGB documents and the original Russian, which I could not read. Anyway, they're doing phenomenal things with this book that's going to come out at the end of February at the Vilnius Book Fair. So if they're going to let this book get published, it's possible they'll let those documentaries and movie get in there too.
Which other languages is your book being translated into?
Well, it's already out in Spanish, and it's also going to get translated into Polish and Hungarian.
There are significant problems with truth in both Poland and Hungary and Ukraine. I think that if you can break through, if we can break through, if the Simon Wiesenthal Center can break through, then we may have an opportunity to have truth about our families. Sylvia, I have to tell you from my perspective, I think you're one of the greatest heroes in the world. For you to have done what you've done, for you to have faced the intimidation that the Lithuanian government has done against you, for you to deal with the hate that you deal with on a daily basis, I stand in awe and respect of you. Rabbi, you had asked if we would leave the last 15 minutes open for a question and answer session. If the audience would like to submit questions, we can address those. But until we start receiving the questions, when Congress addressed the Lithuanian government and instructed them to stop misusing US congressional documents for Holocaust revisionism, did you expect a response from the government?
I hoped for one.
But there never was one.
No, there never was one.
The case, we've submitted cases through every court in Lithuania, through the parliament, the president, the prime minister, through the public prosecutor, and there has been total collusion in government agencies, the courts and the prosecutor's office, to affirm your grandfather as a national hero and a rescuer of Jews. Have you ever asked the Lithuanian government to identify a single Jew they claim your grandfather rescued?
Well, I've written blogs pointing that out. During my last trip in Lithuania, I was giving a speech at the Vilna Gaon Museum to a nice crowd there, and one of the people asked me, what do I make of this idea of the Genocide Center saying that he rescued Jews? And here's what I said to them. I said, while he was governor of Cholet during the Nazi occupation, he had 3 friends. And what I think happened is he was aware of those 3 friends saving at least 10 Jews. So I think out of friendship to those 3 friends, he said, okay, save your Jews. In the meantime, he's taking care of 8,000.
Or 15,000.
Or 15,000. So I think it's possible to do both. Like, just because you helped passively let your friends save 10 Jews out of friendship, you can do that, and you can play a role in murdering 8,000 to 15,000. And I brought up what happened in our own country here in the United States during slavery times. I mean, plantation owners had their favorite slaves in the house, and some of them even loved them, but then they treated the slaves in the fields horribly. So human nature's quite complex. We're very contradictory. We do one thing one day, you know, so you can do both, but then you have to put everything on the scales. Okay, is the saving of these 10 Jews and the killing of
Let
the
me rephrase
8,000.
that. Sorry, hold on, Sylvia. Let me rephrase that. Is the not murdering of these 10 Jews.
Right. Okay.
Not saving, because Noreka was doing the murdering, so he just didn't murder those 10 Jews at that time. He left them for somebody else to murder later, or somebody else to murder them almost immediately. So let's just change terminology, that not rescuing, just not murdering at that moment.
Yeah, and it was a very passive sort of action compared to very active action to what he was doing, you know, and his official capacity is murdering the Jews. So,
Sylvia, there've been a few questions that have come in. Let me start with Allison's. How has this affected your relationship with your family?
I guess with my brother, he's been great. He's been very supportive. My father finally came around. He kept saying, why does it have to be you? Why can't it be a historian who wrote this book? Why is it you? And I would say, I don't know, Tete. I think you know, maybe because I'm his granddaughter, I can get a lot more attention to the story than anyone else. So, and then he still didn't believe that Jonas Noreka killed Jews, but this year he read the book twice. And after the second time, he said, you know what, Sylvia, maybe you're onto something. So, so I think I finally changed my father's mind. But I have relatives in Lithuania who are really upset with me. And they use a very common response that is among most Lithuanians. He didn't personally kill Jews. He wasn't a žydšaudis, which is a Jew shooter. And in the seminar that I did with Toli there, I had a slide, and I had to put up their genocide machine. And I had, at the top, I had Hitler propaganda, Germans. And then I had identified Jews, Lithuanians, round them up, Lithuanians, bring them to the ghetto or the central point, Lithuanians, guard them, Lithuanians, march them into the woods, Lithuanians, and then shoot them. And then I said, of all these people on the slide, who's guilty? And then I had them like talk in little groups and come out. And at the end, they do what everybody does when I do this, and they say, they're all guilty. It's not just the last guy who shot the Jew that's guilty. They're all guilty.
They're all guilty. That's Sylvia. How do you handle this emotionally?
Well, I have some good friends, but my biggest thing is my Catholic faith. That's what gets me through it all the time. And as I was working on this story, you know, I had a prayer that I said every day, multiple times a day, and it was something like, you know, God, if this is true, if this is really true, you're going to have to help me, because this is so overwhelming. I cannot do this myself. And I'll do what I can as a journalist, as a writer, and as his granddaughter. I'll do my part, but you're going to have to step in, and you're going to have to send help, because this is like crushing me. This is so hard. So that was my prayer all the time.
There's a question from Joan Wheeler, who says, who does the government say murdered the 220,000 Jewish people and rounded them up? For the most part, the government says nobody knows. Nobody saw.
The Nazis. They say the Nazis.
The Nazis or the Soviets.
No, well, the Nazis.
Yeah. And they cannot figure out which Lithuanians did it. One day the Jews were there, and the houses were there, and the property was there, and then suddenly it was as if the aliens came. And so Joan, the government of Lithuania is fully engaged in Holocaust denial and revision. And that's, there was an anonymous attendee that said, you mentioned something about US congressional documents being used to propagate Holocaust denial. What documents were those? This was a case of the interim Lithuanian Prime Minister, Brazaitis. The Lithuanian government manipulated congressional documents fraudulently. Congress stepped in once. They blew it off. Congress stepped in a second time. The Lithuanian government response was, our members of Congress are just politicians, and they know more about US law and US protocol than American members of Congress, and they were sticking by their decision, their Holocaust revision decision. How many Jews were there in Lithuania before the Holocaust and how many survived? There was 3.6% survival rate of Jews inside Lithuania. The annihilation was almost complete. The Jews that survived were the Jews that had been deported in the Soviet deportations before the Holocaust began in Lithuania. The killings of Jews began before the Nazis arrived, and there was hardly a single Jew left alive on Lithuanian land afterwards. Marilyn Goodrich speaks about Howard Margol, who was a saint well before your time, Sylvia. You wouldn't know him. Marilyn, I don't know if that still exists, if that foundation still exists. There are a number of other questions, but has the government of Israel done anything to assist either or both of you in your work? Robert, I will answer that. The government of Israel represents living Israelis. They do not represent dead Jews. I have no expectation of the Israeli government getting involved. Israel was a signatory to the statement this week that Lithuania is a Holocaust distortion state. That is as much as we would expect from the government of Israel. A step further, just on that point, because we still have 5 minutes, the murderer of Prime Minister Netanyahu's grandmother's family is another that Lithuania has converted into one of their heroes. The murderer of President Herzog's grandmother's family is considered a national hero of Lithuania. This is a pervasive government program that was exposed by Ephraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center decades ago, and Lithuania has never relented and never been willing to tell the truth.
How many are there, do you think, Grant?
Sylvia, I don't know. I have at least a dozen on my list that I've been able to identify, but I don't speak Lithuanian. I don't know Russian, no Hebrew, no Yiddish. So I'm very limited in my research ability, but nonetheless, your grandfather was the first one I identified, and I've identified about a dozen more since then. The government of Lithuania has kicked up their jackboots and stood firmly, and they stand by their murderers. They consider those as their national heroes. The man that called for the ethnic cleansing and elimination of Jews, the government said that was just an incident of anti-Semitism. Even though he was supposed to be prime minister and he was the Lithuanian ambassador to Germany, and he called for the elimination of Jews from Lithuania, and that decree still stands. It's never been revoked.
Well, he wasn't a Jew shooter. He wasn't a Zhichodes. So that's their mentality. Unless you were the last guy on that list, everybody else gets a free pass.
But the last guy on the list, they will never be able to identify those names because there were no Jews to tell, and they didn't rat each other out. Sylvia, we're at the top of the hour. I'd like to now bring in Alison. Alison, could you join us, please? While we're waiting for Alison, let's see what other questions came through. Oh, Alison, you're on here twice. Okay. Sylvia, going forward. Oh, Alison, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Thank you. I apologize. Thank you. I want to thank both of you profusely for your conversation. I know how hard and difficult this is for you, Sylvia. You are a hero. I mean, you investigated something and found out that your grandfather was not the person that you thought he was and the hero that he thought he was. And for Grant, I know this has been a lifelong pursuit for you as well. And your family should all live in peace. And I'm sure they bless you for what you're doing. I'd like to thank the Bremen Museum for being an incredible partner for everything that we do, and to Rabbi Joseph Prast for beginning the conversation and talking about how important it is. I do represent, as we said earlier, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and we are a Jewish global human rights organization that researches the Holocaust and hate in historic and contemporary contexts. And we have to keep fighting anti-Semitism. I would like to thank the Community Engagement Committee of the Midwest region of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for helping to bring this together. And as we close this evening, I would like to dedicate tonight in the conversation and both of your activism in memory of those who were murdered during the Holocaust. And we must all together reaffirm our vow to fight anti-Semitism and hate in any form, as we are watching it rear its ugly head again in this country and around the world. Bless you all. Thank you, everybody who joined us this evening. And again, thank you for the wonderful partnership with the Bremen Museum. My name is Alison Pierce-Loban. I'm delighted to be here from the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison.